Namaskar. I welcome you all on behalf of Atharva for this talk on ethics of war, Hindu ethics of war, with redoubtable Sandeep Balakrishnan. And we like to have some chat based on what he has worked on. Sanatan Dharma actually we can say a living civilization which has evolved over eons, and it has nearly coded every aspect of human life, every aspect of this lok and paralok, and also on various aspects of statecraft, of human living, everything. So of that, there is also codification of war ethics or how to fight a battle, which has been evinced since the time of Vedas. Many Hindus may not be aware of what Vedas say about the ethics of war, which Sandeep will clarify. But of course, they know about Mahabharata, they know about Ramayana, and they are ingrained in their DNA. So whenever something happens, they will say, this is not dharma, this is not the way it should have been done. So there is something in our DNA which tells us that what is right, what is wrong, even when you're fighting a battle. Now to understand this topic further, we have Sandeep Balakrishnan. He is a public intellectual, and his site dharmadispatch.in is a site which is a mine of information. I make it a point to read all his essays. He's not only trying to re-establish the honorable great historians of India who have done wonderful work, but who have been sidelined by the so-called Marxist cabal, calling itself something like a Marxist history. He has also worked on various aspects, bringing out the unknown stories of history, the unknown stories of battles to keep the civilization alive. And he also writes on contemporary issues, digging out the details which are generally lost in our current scenario, the way we look at history. So that is the most interesting part. Could you please, Sandeep, briefly explain what you call as the war ethics of Bharatiya or Hindu civilization? You have begun with the Vedic times, and we also see that you have gone to Dahir, Prithviraj, and we have seen evolution of this ethics. So to basically understand, how do you define the ethics of Hindu war?
Yeah, thank you, Ratanji, for the wonderful introduction. So actually, Hindu code of war ethics, when you understand it in our language, in any Bharatiya Bhasha, it simply means Yuddha Niti, right? So the question, one natural or obvious question that arises when you are talking about war, why do you even need ethics in a war? Because
Yeah,
anybody who goes into war, a physical military kind of a war, goes in to win. Nobody goes into a physical warfare to lose or to make a compromise or a truce or whatever it is. The objective, the sole objective is to win the war.
true.
So therefore, another logical import of this conception is that there are no ethics, there is only victory. So why do we need war ethics is a question our ancient asks. Because for a simple reason that they considered all of civilization, all of the cosmos as a factor, as a force for the good, and anything that disturbs that factor, that force for the good, should be rooted out, right? So this is a completely different, from here we see the seeds of what is known as a code of war ethics. Like all of us are familiar, like even you are familiar, that non-combatant innocent citizens should not be harmed, children should not be harmed, women should not be harmed, uh, whatever, fields should not be set on fire, houses should not be burned or destroyed.
True.
This is what, these are all later evolutions, but the genius of our war ethics is very simple, that war is inevitable. As long as, why do war arises, right? So it arises from a mix of what is known as raga and dvesha. Meaning raga is attachment, dvesha is enmity or whatever, jealousy and all that. So it is a mix of that. And where is this derived from, raga and dvesha? it comes from kama and krodha, from greed or desire. It's not, when I say kama, it's not just sexual desire. It is
True.
desire for property. It is desire for whatever wealth, whatever it is, right? So, a constant friction between these primordial forces and impulses which are inside us give rise to war. Sometimes wars were also fought just so that that particular tribe or whatever survives. Because when you are in a land of scarcity, when you are in a land that has very harsh geographic and other conditions, you have to raid another person and who's minding his own business.
Yeah, but you can also not deny there were also wars for expansion of a
I'll
state.
tell you, I'll come to that.
Yeah.
So these are the origins, basically. Why do wars arise? And sometimes it's just plain greed, like I said, right? So within this, there was, if you look at all aspects of our life, the human life, and how our ancients kind of designed it as a principle, you had on the cosmic scale, you had something called Rita, which means the cosmic order which maintains the all of creation. This
Right.
Rita, when it is translated in human life, becomes dharma. And to maintain dharma, several elements are needed, but foremost of which is something called satya. And what is known as samanya dharma, satya, shaucha, asteya, and indriya nigraha. The rest of this thing, you're familiar with Yoga Shastra. So all these factors went into making what is known as the Hindu code of war ethics. Basically, that, if at our ancients also realized the need that, a simple truth that, the hardest thing for any person to do is to mind his own business.
Right.
So, for some reason or the other, like I said, it is the operation of these passions, these, rajasic and tamasic passions that, make you covet another man's property, another man's women, or whatever it is. So, but our ancients realized this. So, they gave in the daily life, they gave a framework for that. Yes, boss, you can enjoy your wealth, you can enjoy whatever it is, all the material pleasures, but this is the framework within which you can enjoy it. And if any force tries to, come and invade you without your fault, you have to hit back and hit back twice as hard. So that is one. Now, in the realm of what you just mentioned, is that there were wars, yes, because they were inevitable. As long as there is land, as long as there is human greed, there will be war. But as far as possible, you minimize the damage or the disastrous consequences of any kind of war. So this is at the foundation of all Hindu code of war ethics.
And see, these ethics worked fine till the war was within the land of Bharat. But when the invaders came from outside, beginning from Dahir's time, there were Turks, there was Mongols, there were Mughals. But since the beginning of the people who came from outside, somehow these ethics or these codes didn't work, they crumbled. Although Chanakya had redefined those codes, he also talked of alternative of war, which he will elaborate later. Those different kind of wars that he had elaborated, somehow I think we forgot about them. You have talked about Kuta Yuddha, you have talked about Lov Yuddha, or some term of that type. So did our kings didn't realize that letting go an enemy which doesn't believe in dharma, who doesn't believe in ethics, would actually do disaster for them. So this failure to understand what Krishna said in Mahabharata, and then Chanakya repeated, that if the enemy is not ethical, then you need not follow the ethics. So do you think that somewhere we lost the grain of actual knowledge of these ethics of war?
Well, there are several different ways to answer this, but they all lead to the same conclusion. Is that, what you spoke about Kuta Yuddha, there is elaborate, different texts give different recognized forms of warfare with gradation. That, a Dharma Yuddha basically means that both you and the enemy recognize the commonly accepted code of war ethics. Like, for example, you can't kill you can't kill innocent, unarmed citizens, non-combatants, children, women. You can't burn down people's houses. So these are some of the war ethics that applied to non-combatants. But between the combatants, and I'm sure you're aware of it, there are, tons of texts, and I'll recommend a beautiful book towards the end of this, which is a great compendium of all the historical literature regarding Hindu code of war ethics. So one of the things it says is that even in the Mahabharata, if you see that, a Rathi can only fight with a Rathi. That is, a charioteer can only fight with a charioteer. And the swordsman, foot soldier can only fight with a foot soldier. A Gadi one who is holding a mace can only fight with another guy who is holding a mace. You can't, kill from behind. You can't shoot arrows from behind or, attack from the back, from the rear, right? A lot of things like that. You can't shoot poisoned arrows. So what is the import of all this? Is that, yes, you're fighting, but it is according to certain mutually agreed rules that neither party should transgress.
But did it ever occur to our okay, carry on, please.
Yeah. So the moment there was a slight breach, and the Mahabharata itself is a great example of the violation of these principles of Dharma Yuddha. Right. So what happened to Abhimanyu? They violated almost every single ethic of war. To kill whom? Just a 16-year-old boy.
True.
Right. That was one. Once that line is breached, then it is free for all.
True.
Right. So one other way of looking at Kurukshetra war is that once this line was crossed, it is free for all. Right. So there is a reason the Mahabharata, the end of Kurukshetra war, and some years later is also the end of a yuga.
True.
It marks the end of Dwapara Yuga, where, one more leg of the cow of Gomata of Dharma got cut. So these are beautiful conceptions which drive home a great spiritual, philosophical, and ethical messages. Right. But, so, yeah. So let me just finish. So once that is done, as long as, like you rightly said, as long as the wars were fought between Hindu kings, or between even Hindu and some Buddhist kings also, they all emanated from this soil. So these Yuddha Niti, Yuddha Dharma, all these things, Dharma Yuddha, all these concepts were ingrained in their blood. That, as far as possible, don't kill the enemy king. Maximum, he has to accept the defeat on his own, or you subdue him and let him live, restore his kingdom, and make sure that the vanquished king, his palace, all his property, his territory, his people, his local culture, traditions remain intact as long as he pays you tribute. So this is the final meaning. When you've heard of Chakravarti, Digvijaya and all that, right? This is a meaning of Digvijaya. Meaning, Ashwamedha and all that. Why is a horse sent everywhere? The horse is a symbol that, because, see, for the longest time, most of the Vedic suttas, you have hundreds and thousands of verses describing the horse, the prowess of the horse, because that was the most powerful and the fastest known animal or living being that man can tame, and which can also be used in war. And the horse is also a symbol of energy, speed, energy, force, power, and all that. So that is why Chakravarti would send the horse for Ashwamedha symbolically. That, without war, I'm giving you an option to accept that I am the Chakravarti, without giving the option of war.
Right.
So how sublime and how cultured and how refined is this conception? Right. So as long as everybody adhered to this, everything was fair and fine. But then you have a system of a completely barbaric system, which like jihad, which is
that brings me just a moment. Yeah. It reminds me that the entire empire that Hindus created outside Bharat, we may be the only civilization which the people whom our kings conquered culturally and also geographically, they love them. You go to Southeast Asia, they were overrun by the kings from the south. Their culture, a new culture came in, they adopted the culture. You go even now, and they still love you. That may be because of the ethics that we followed with the people who the kings won over.
Correct.
That is something remarkable, I think, about our civilization.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
since you talk of jihad, I would specifically ask, did our kings or their mantris never really tried to study what would you promise that was jihad understood? Or I would say, why we can expand it further, the foreign way of crusades or jihad or inquisition, these are all forms of various wars that imposed on us. So how do they differ, and did we ever try to analyze that you cannot have a fight with people who have an entirely different principle of warmongering? I mean, you can explain crusade and jihad in those terms, that how totally radically they were different for our people, and whether our people failed to understand, or it was just that we will not change, let others do whatever they do.
Okay, fantastic. And I think I'll build on something you had asked previously about Dahir and other people.
Yes.
Is that, see, when jihad came into India, it was first time with Muhammad bin Qasim, as you also know very well. Is that by that time, India, classical India as we know, had been completely shattered. It was still a completely Hindu land, whatever. I mean, I include Buddhism, all faiths that emerged from this soil are all Hindu, are all Sanatana. So let's not make any distinction there. So although it was completely Hindu or Sanatana, they had lost what I call as Aryavarta consciousness, meaning that there is an element of cultural fusion which began all the way beyond Afghanistan till Kanyakumari.
True.
Imagine the sweep of land, right? So what is it, while they kind of had this cultural unity in mind, that is the biggest failure, after the disintegration, especially of the Gupta Empire.
True.
That was the pinnacle, India had reached after the Mauryas, perhaps even greater. Whatever culture, art, music, painting, whatever other new developments or refurbishing of philosophy, classical literature that we practice all over India, even today, you can directly trace it back to some or the other element of the Gupta period, right? So once that was gone, India was fragmented. You had large, empires which kept rising and falling, like, waves which will, go there and then suddenly fall.
True.
And then the sea will go back and then some other new wave will come. This is the closest analogy I can give. So by the time Qasim came, and he didn't occupy much, he didn't leave a permanent settlement except perhaps in Multan and Mansura. Both of them are in Pakistan. So
I might just interject for a moment, because people are not aware that actually Muhammad bin Qasim attacked Dahir because he gave asylum to Prophet Muhammad's family.
Well, that is one strand of history, although there is no solid evidence for that. The point is, before Dahir, the caliph, 4 caliphs had come, right? The first 4 pious caliphs. All the 4 together with with all the 4 pious caliphs, they had sent as many as 28 or 30 expeditions to attack India. All of them flopped. All of them. Thane, Makran, Debal, and then Zabul, all of them flopped. So this, over a period of 60, 70 years, nothing happened. But then Dahir grew complacent again, because we had lost the overall Aryavarta consciousness. Dahir was left to fend for himself.
True.
They became complacent. They thought nothing about these, Muslim traders coming in and doing basically spying. They were doing resi. So, ठीक है, बाप परदादा के टाइम से आ रहा है, ऐसे ही चलता रहेगा. So this is one of the biggest a failure that occurred till the Vijayanagar Empire. Even the Marathas really didn't, for all the revival, the biggest failure was a failure not to study the core tenets of this peaceful religion. So once this Aryavarta consciousness was lost, how long can you defend a determined invader whose determination comes from the tenets of his religion? they will come back. They will keep coming back. That is the
Right.
whole point, right? Because,
Mhm.
fabled land of him. And these were not, warriors, military men in the ordinary sense. They had two major backings, two major motivating factors. One is this, whatever their religious jihad concept. And the second was their lust for plunder. And third was that they never gave up. So I call this what you call the principle of Diwali to Ugadi. Okay. So Diwali typically begins by the start of the winter month.
Mhm.
So the early invasions which began, from northwest India, Afghanistan, these are all extremely cold and very treacherous places. So once Diwali ends, our kings, during the cold season, especially in the northern and northwestern frontiers, pretty much became complacent. These guys would regroup, and they would repeatedly attack. By the time Ugadi was there, by the time the summer months had begun, our guys they would have Hindu kings would have left their frontiers open so that these armies from Afghanistan, northwestern India,
Mhm.
outside that, they would land on the plain land.
Sure.
Once you fight a battle on the plains, it's anybody's guess, which way the result outcome can go any which
Mhm.
way.
Mhm.
This is the other major failure. So that is, like you said, the failure of Hindu kings becoming complacent, allowing the enemy repeatedly, not once or twice,
Mhm.
repeatedly to launch these invasions. And on the point of, the concept of jihad, I refer you, I'm sure, I don't know if you've read it. It is written by Brigadier S.K. Malik, who was a retired
Mhm. Yeah.
Pakistani brigadier. It's called the Quranic concept of war,
Right.
where he gives us a one-to-one derivation about what uh, war really means according to the Quran. And he brings in all these jihadi elements also. Basically, he says that it is not a physical war. It is not merely a military conquest, but it is to keep the enemy in a state of constant fear.
Yes.
So that what happens when you are in a state of constant fear? You will lose your productivity. You will have to divert all your resources, or a major portion of your resources,
Mhm.
to be aware of the threat of this war, which means he has occupied your psyche. And he says it in so many words that, it is not the fear that, we wish to impose, but it is the will. It is the Islamic will that we wish to impose on the enemy's psyche. He mentions it in so many words. So this is not new. He traces, gives evidence from the Quran itself. So this is pretty much what we fail to understand. What Hindu kings up to Shivaji also fail to understand. Because
Mhm.
it is inconceivable, after the Delhi Sultanate took root, it is inconceivable that Hindu soldiers would fight on behalf of this alien invader.
Yeah.
So you see where the failure lies.
Yes. I would also add that there are also the typical rewards of war that the
Hmm,
Quranic concept gives you,
hmm,
that makes you lust for war, because ultimately you're going to gain personally from the war.
hmm,
Compared to the concept that we had, I think this very, very different way, the way
hmm,
you look at the rewards of war,
hmm,
where you use the cover of religion, you use the cover of jihad to
hmm.
actually enrich yourself.
No, actually, it is the other way around. You don't use religion to justify it. The religion asks you to wage war, because it is basically a global imperialism. It commands you, in so many words, to wage war so that, the whole earth becomes Islamized. It's not just snatching away India, or it's not snatching away Indonesia, or, Yemen or Turkey or whatever. No, it is to
But aren't
take
they
over.
also,
It is
there is
to
also,
uh,
reward given to you for spreading that word.
that is, yeah, well, those are all motivations, that you'll
So
get
you
these
are saying,
72
see,
virgins and all. Hmm.
we say that you must fight war ethically, or you can be ostracized, as you have mentioned in some other places,
Yes,
that you will be ostracized if you don't follow the rules of law. On the
yes.
other side, the Abrahamic concept of war tells you will be rewarded for, breaking the ethics,
Absolutely.
the very basic moral of the society.
So the point is, great question actually, great point. So here, when you speak about this jihad and Quranic concept of war, there are no rules basically. It doesn't recognize that you should not harm civilians, or there are certain boundaries you must not cross. There are no such rules. It is a system of total conquest and all-out war. At every stage, the greater the barbarity, if you have read these various accounts written by Muslim historians, you'll be horrified.
And they gloat over it.
And they gloat over it in such, filthy terms actually. They mountains of skulls and, slitting of throats of thousands of brahmanas and, slave taking. Slave taking was introduced in India by Islamic invasions. This concept was alien. So there is a beautiful book on this.
Even taking women,
children,
property.
Women and children.
Right.
Young children, they would be sold as slaves. So, I mean, we had not too many people today know that Lahore was a thriving slave market.
Yes.
And where did these slaves come from? They came from Gujarat. They came from Karnataka later, much later. They came from Warangal in Andhra. They came from Haryana. In fact, which is a place today, it's near, I think, Thanesar or something. It used to be one of the commercial hubs, like a slave auction market for a long time, for at least 200, 250 years. So this was completely alien. And the sorry fact is we didn't learn anything from that. But anyway, we have discussed that. I don't want to repeat that again.
No, but then see, the question again arises, knowing that what is happening. One is that, okay, when Muhammad bin Qasim attacked Lahir, Hindus were not aware of what kind of nature of war it is. But after facing that war for 500 years, how come that we are still stuck with the Rama's concept of Dharma Yuddha, not even Krishna's concept, not even Chanakya's. So where have we had the civilizational memory loss?
No, I mean, when you say Rama, Krishna and Chanakya, all three followed the same concept of war.
Yes, but in the time of Rama, there was no idea of, breaking the rules. If you remember, there was hardly any breaking of rules on either side. From Mahabharata onwards, we had continuous break of ethics, continuous break of rules, and Chanakya codified it.
No, I mean, if you talk about Rama, killing Vali was an act of dharma. Although he broke the rules of war, killing Vali was an act of dharma. Right. So, I mean, if you want to nitpick,
but those were exceptions. Yes,
if you want to nitpick, but then
and he justified it. It was not that it was taken.
Yeah, it was dharma. So any act taken, any action, even if it is considered to be evil, any action taken with the ultimate goal of preserving dharma, maintaining dharma, is also dharma. It is justified. So this is what we lost over, like I said, when we lost the Aryavarta consciousness. Look, when the Hunas and the Shakas came in during Guptas, right? They were no less barbaric than Muslims. They were no less barbaric. But, it was not even like the Huna invasion of India is not even a topic anybody remembers.
True.
Why? Because of the way they were, decisively beaten.
True.
And the Hunas were animists, what are known as pagans. So, why they lost out was because they lacked this justification of that the Quranic concept gives you. That's why they lost. Even Genghis Khan was an animist, and he raised almost all the way up to Baghdad, total all-out war, and they surrendered. So, but then why these people succeeded is partly 70% because of what the loss of Aryavarta consciousness. That, this is a sacred land. That Kshatra, we should not fight. Fine, you could recognize each other's boundaries. But the enemy, study the nature of the enemy and his motivations. This is what we lost. On the other hand, what we did was when Muhammad of Ghazni, he was helped by Anandapala, the son of Jaipala. Jaipala did not surrender at all to Ghazni. His own son or grandson, I think. He writes a letter to Muhammad of Ghazni saying, look, don't think that I'm weak or something because I've helped you. This fellow helps Muhammad of Ghazni when he is in trouble. What kind of craziness is this?
True.
This is because this is what Chanakya also saw when he noticed that Alexander could succeed only because of the disunity and internal fights between all these Janapadas. He said, there has to be one strong center, one extraordinary monarchy with a loosely federated state system.
Yes.
Which is a foundation even today. Unfortunately, we've forgotten that. That is how he was able to unite the whole country for the first time politically also. So this we lost. After the Guptas, this consciousness we lost. So everything, we can speak about, how great we were and all that is all good. It's all inspiring and all that. But this is something we Hindus as a people still don't seem to kind of get it. We have not preserved it in our active memory. We have preserved it at an individual level. But at a social, community and a national level, we still have a political system that is not civilizational. On the contrary,
recently you had put up a poster about the biggest crime. So can you repeat that quote?
Yeah, I forgot. Yeah, I think what was that again?
It was the biggest crime was, the way we treated our cultural civilization, I think, post-independence. Because that reminds me that although whatever we forgot till the time of, totally subdued by the Muslims and by the British later on, the invaders, even after 47, we have not really picked up from where we left off hundreds of years back. So that is the reason. That brings me to last, section. You have described three kind of wars. So can you please elaborate so our people, our viewers can actually understand the concept of three kinds of wars you have described?
Yeah. Three kinds of victories, basically.
Three kinds of victories, yes.
The first is Dharma Vijayi, Lobha Vijayi and Asura Vijayi. So Dharma Vijayi is what we just discussed about the Hindu ethics of warfare.
Right.
Where the victorious king not only gives back or retains, allows the defeated king to retain his territories and his family, his culture and whatever. He's okay as long as the defeated king acknowledges supremacy. So this is a regular Dharma Vijayi. He does not demand or extort. Just pay me an annual tribute and acknowledge me as your master. That is Dharma Vijayi. Second is Asura Vijayi, where the victorious king, Dharma Vijayi is the number one. It is supposed to be the best of all victories, the most ideal victory. The second rung is Lobha Vijayi. So Lobha Vijayi is where the defeated king takes off the entire treasury, all the wealth of the defeated king. But he largely allows the defeated king to either retain his territory or put him in like a token kind of position. But there is an element of humiliation involved. Right? Everything that you have earned so far with such hard work is taken away, from you, and a penalty, public penalty, is imposed on you. There is an element of humiliation involved. In Dharma Vijayi, there is no element of humiliation. It's a man-to-man fight. May the best man win, and the winner does not take it all. He gives a shake hand and he says, boss, acknowledge your defeat because I have proved my superior. So this is Dharma Vijayi. The next where an element of humiliation is involved is Lobha Vijayi. The worst is Asura Vijayi, where the defeated king could or could not be, may or may not be beheaded or slaughtered or whatever, or he'll be taken as a slave. His family, his royal parivar, his entire what you know, the harem, his wives, daughters, sons, whatever, they are degraded. They are either made as, you know, slaves or vassals, not vassals, but slaves or whatever. His entire treasury is taken. An enormous kind of humiliation is imposed on the defeated person. So Asura Vijayi ranks as the worst of all in our Hindu code of war ethics. Something that is even worse than Asura Vijayi is jihad. Because jihad is something that even today, it is very hard to imagine that, you know, war can even be fought like this. Where there are no boundaries, no rules, no ethics. Now, Prithviraj Chauhan is a classic example. Only a Hindu king could forgive someone like Prithviraj could forgive someone like Muhammad Ghori.
Right.
If it was a battle between two Muslim kings, it was an all-out thing.
Yeah, one would have been finished.
Completely all out. You grab everything, smash and grab, basically. So this is a difference. So it is worse than Asura Vijayi. So that is what something we need to keep in mind. And even when, you know, whatever the so-called communal riots happen, what is the kind of stuff that we see on TV now? Smashing public property, setting on fire, spitting. You know, there is an innate element of brutality and barbarism, which is injected by design. Because no human can have a stomach for that kind of barbarism. Blood flowing on the streets, you know, chopped limbs, taken or gouged out eyes. Nobody can have a stomach for that, and it is there, instilled there by design. You're not only shocked and disgusted, you're terrified. That is the objective. It brings us back again to Brigadier S.K. Malik. The object is to strike terror.
Right. And see, coming to this typical kind of war, see, even though we are not taught dharmic concept of war, as I said in the beginning, the DNA that we have has never allowed our soldiers to behead or mutilate the dead, which is the practice with our neighbors. Whether so mostly on the side of jihad, where they have mutilated and also insulted the dead or even their own. So that innate nature of ours is already ingrained in them, but there is also something ingrained in us, which I have not been able to fathom yet. I've asked many scholars that what our army wins on the battlefield is lost on the negotiation table. So why there are two kinds of DNAs, one that belongs to our army and one that gets into the minds of our, infects our mind of our diplomats and our, you know, diplomats and officers and politicians who try to be good boys, try to be very big-hearted like Prithviraj Chauhan, who was coerced, didn't know. But at least now these people know. And why it happens, I mean, this always puzzles me. So they have not read any of these Chanakya, or because they are Western. So their entire concept is West-oriented. They have not read Chanakya, neither Mahabharata or Veda. We are very sure of that. But they must have read Machiavelli. Since they have Western concept of war, even after reading Machiavelli, how can they repeatedly make this mistake? Whether it's 47, whether it's 65, 71, or even Gilgit, you know, Kargil, every day it happens. So what is it in our genes that we have two kinds of thought processes running parallelly, while one recognizes that what kind of valor we have, what kind of fight we can carry on, that grand tradition of our army. On the other side, we have defeatist or timid attitude when we sit on the diplomatic tables.
Okay, you want a polite answer or a truthful answer?
Why should I? We are discussing war, so how can we be polite about war?
Okay, so
see, we need to be very truthful about what lacks, you know, in our character, that somehow, in spite of having such a great civilization where we have not lost any war after 62, and the only war we lost our independence is 1962. That too because we were very foolish about the entire enterprise. So it's a different discussion. We won't get into that. So in spite of such a wonderful tradition, why it happens? As I said, even if you have not read Indian treatise, at least read Western treatise, who are equally ruthless. So then why is it the ruthless in the sense of diplomacy, not in the sense of war? So why it happens?
Okay.
Ultimately, when we have ethics of war, we have ethics of victor also. So where do we lack?
Okay. So we can approach this, you know, question, fantastic question, from 3 or 4 perspectives. Okay. the civilizational and historical perspective is one. Because of nearly 1,000 years of constant invasions and you're living under a ruthless oppressive rule, which is a religious despotism, followed by a horrible culture killing colonialism. So something changes in your psyche, right? But the biggest blow, even bigger than the cultural destruction by the British of Hindus, even bigger than that was secularism, which can correctly be traced back to Gandhi. He called it Sarvadharma Samabhava, but it's all the same thing. That's a discussion for another day, which basically blurred the line between who you are and what you're facing, and what your real enemy is, rather than what your real enemy is. So it blurred the distinction in peacetime. So that is from the historical, psychological, and civilizational perspective. Second, post-independence, all the wars you mentioned, right, from 48 onwards till Kargil, except 1962. There is a sharp divide between our military, between the values instilled in our military and the complete lack of values in our political class. The military protects the debasement of our political class. Like you said, what we win on the battlefield is lost on the negotiating table. We all know who ruled India after independence for the longest time. So what was the psyche of that, of this ruling class who ruled us for the longest time? They had a zero civilizational consciousness. And even till the early 70s, Indians here would regularly be in touch with their Pakistani counterparts. Pakistanis had zero confusion about what their identity was. We were apologizing for them. So you have a political class that is made up of this kind of psyche. So if they don't, so logically, anybody endowed with this mentality would definitely give away the victory on the battlefield. They want to be this goody guy. We are so magnanimous. If they had any sense, the day India was broken, the day Pakistan was broken into Bangladesh, we should have, and I make no bones in saying it, we should have annexed Bangladesh or East Pakistan to India. United Bengal would become united again. Well, this is what Hindu Rashtra is, right? In a tangential fashion. Look at the condition of Hindus in Bangladesh now. We liberated it from Pakistan, but didn't, liberate it into India. It is a civilizational necessity. If Hindu
Not only that, even with 90,000 army men with us, we didn't close the Kashmir issue.
Yeah,
whatever it was for worth it was left open.
Yeah. So
again, on the basis of false premises, that false promises they made as a takiya, I would say, that I will come back to you and we'll accept it and all that. So are we so innocent, or we have that mentality? That is what comes to my mind again and again.
No, after a certain generation, especially after the 70s generation, we just stopped caring. We just stopped caring. ठीक है, चल रहा है, कोई चला रहा है देश को. Why? Because you made politics. It is a noble calling. Any calling is noble as long as it is endowed with integrity and some principles. What is a class of political? What is a ethics or whatever it is? A political class. What is it? So the point is, our military is protecting this class, and unfortunately, they are beholden to this class of people.
So I would not put it as beholden to this class. Probably the way it is. The democratic system is that they have different roles to play, but somehow I think the people on the ruling side, whether diplomats or politicians, did not play their role. Military played its role.
Yeah, military definitely played its role. So
Hmm.
that's what I'm saying. Whoever is controlling the military, right? The military can't rebel against
True.
the elected government, right? So that's what I meant when I said they're beholden to the ruling class by checks and balances. So the point is, you mentioned Kashmir, 90,000 soldiers and people who are guarding there. The point here is that who are they defending? They are defending, they are dying for a political class that makes secret deals in Delhi with Pakistani diplomats and other people. And there is enough, and now they're brazen about it, right?
Yeah.
So there is no fear of punishment for the political class. They are pretty much immune to get away with doing whatever they are doing.
Yeah, now this
Why
Ladakh,
has
Doklam,
this
all the
happened?
2 years
Why
of
has this happened?
skirmishes. Yeah, they show that. Those 2
Yeah,
years of skirmishes with China
yeah,
shows the true color of our people who were ruling the government
correct.
for so long. From front of
Yeah,
the
so
back,
these
covertly by leftists and overtly by the Congress. That mentality was
Congress
there.
and the
So I'll
diplomats
just
that
quote one of
Congress
your
cultivated.
quotes
Hmm.
to round off.
Okay.
VVR Dikshitar, as you noted in your article,
Hmm.
the gradual extinction of the martial qualities by misplaced generosity through forgiving dangerous enemies who sought shelter or refuge in order to study the enemy's weakness and then attack him with redoubled force.
Hmm.
The sad fate of Prithviraj Chauhan at the close of the Hindu period tells an eloquent tale of military tragedy of an ancient India. So I
Absolutely.
think rounds off what is the gap between the ethics of war as understood by us in terms of noble society that was existing vis-a-vis the kind of victories you talked about, Kuta Yuddha and various other different forms of war, and we are mixing up the two and having none of the good of either of them.
Absolutely, that's a good way to put it. But the point again here is that we have a political system that actively not only discriminates, but it fights against the Hindu civilization. So unless the political class develops a civilizational sense and propagates it within its ranks and mostly urgently in the education system, things will go on like this. Perhaps till when, I don't know, till some kind of breaking point is reached.
Yeah.
I don't know. I hope it doesn't happen in my lifetime.
So you want to make any closing remarks?
That's it. I mean, these are my closing
remarks. Okay. Thank you,
right,
Sandeep.
Sir. Thank you, Ratanji.
Thank you so much. Thanks for an enlightening talk.
Yeah. Thanks, Atharva.